There is a version of the First World War that most people carry somewhere in the back of their minds. It involves mud and courage and sacrifice. It involves men going over the top with their chins set and their rifles forward. And somewhere in that image there is a kind of terrible dignity, a sense that even the worst of it had meaning. That version of the war is a construction. It was built carefully, over decades, by governments and newspapers and families who needed the dead to have died for something. And it has been so thoroughly reinforced by monuments and ceremonies and school curricula that most people have never had reason to look behind it. This narration is about what is behind it. The First World War was not a tragedy in the classical sense. A tragedy implies that something went wrong, that choices were made which could have been made differently, that fate intervened in a story that might otherwise have ended well. The First World War was not that. It was a system operating more or less as systems operate, producing outcomes that were entirely predictable to anyone willing to read the data, and the data was available. The generals had it. The ministers had it. The medical officers buried under their case files had it. The war went on, not because no one understood what was happening, but because the institutional momentum of 4 industrialized nations had achieved a velocity that no individual decision could arrest. In the summer of 1916, somewhere along the Somme, a British infantry patrol walked into the fog and did not come back. There was nothing unusual about this. Patrols disappeared regularly. The line between the British and German trenches, a strip of ground averaging perhaps 200 yards across, was crossed every night by men whose job it was to gather information, cut wire, identify enemy positions, or simply demonstrate to their own command that the ground was being monitored. A significant number of these men were killed or captured before they returned. A smaller number simply vanished, leaving behind no body, no equipment, no explanation. The patrol along the Somme in that summer was one of many. It was logged. It was noted in the regimental diary. Then it was moved past, because there was always something else to move past. That patrol is not famous. No one knows their names now except historians who have spent time with regimental records in regional archives. They were not commemorated separately. They became part of the aggregate. The mass of men who disappeared during the Somme campaign of 1916, which absorbed over 1 million casualties across both sides in roughly 4.5 months. They were accounted for, in the bureaucratic sense, as missing. Their families received the standard communication. Their personal effects were collected where they existed. Their rations ceased. The war continued. To understand what the First World War actually was, you have to begin not in 1914 but considerably earlier, in the industrial transformation of European society during the second half of the 19th century. The technologies that made the war possible were not developed for war. The railway network that allowed Germany to mobilize and deploy millions of men within days was built for commerce. The chemical industry that produced both explosives and poison gas was built for agriculture and manufacturing. The steel mills that produced the shells were built to fill a civilian market that had been growing for decades. When the war came, these systems were simply redirected. They were already in place. They already had the capacity. All that changed was the product and the destination. This matters because it explains the scale. The scale of the First World War is often described as something that surprised everyone, as if the generals and politicians looked up one day and found themselves presiding over carnage they had never anticipated. That is not accurate. The logistical capacity for mass industrial warfare had been modeled and planned and wargamed for years. The German Schlieffen Plan, which was the operational framework for Germany's Western strategy, had been in development since the 1890s. The British Army had been observing the American Civil War and the Russo-Japanese War and drawing conclusions about what modern firepower did to infantry formations. The French Army had conducted studies. Everyone had done studies. What the studies consistently showed was that modern rifles and machine guns and artillery had fundamentally altered the relationship between offensive and defensive action. An entrenched defender with a magazine rifle could deliver several aimed shots per minute at distances well over half a mile. A machine gun could sustain several hundred rounds per minute for as long as the ammunition held and the barrel didn't overheat. Artillery had extended its range and improved its accuracy to the point where concentrations of troops anywhere within range of enemy observation were vulnerable to destruction within minutes. The studies showed, repeatedly, and with considerable mathematical precision, that attacking under these conditions would produce extremely high casualties for the attacking force. The studies were filed. The plans that called for offensive action proceeded. This is the foundational fact of the First World War, and it is the one that the romantic version of the war most consistently elides. The commanders knew in broad terms what their offensives would cost before they launched them. They launched them anyway, because the alternative was to sit in the trenches indefinitely, which was also killing men, just more slowly, and which ceded the initiative to the enemy, which was militarily and politically unacceptable. The men who ordered the attacks were not ignorant of the cost. They calculated the cost. They found it acceptable. This is the reality that the monuments and the ceremonies do not quite capture. The Somme campaign of 1916 is the most concentrated expression of this logic in the entire war. The campaign was planned for months. It was designed to relieve pressure on the French army at Verdun, which had been under sustained German assault since February, and was approaching the limits of what it could endure. The British would attack on a broad front along the Somme River, drawing German reserves northward, forcing Germany to fight on two sectors simultaneously, theoretically causing the German line to buckle somewhere. The plan required a massive preliminary bombardment to destroy the German defenses before the infantry advanced. The British fired approximately 1.5 million shells in the 7 days before the attack began on the 1st of July, 1916. The bombardment did not work as planned. The German trenches in this sector were exceptionally deep, some of them 40 feet below the surface, reinforced with concrete and timber, designed specifically to shelter troops during precisely this kind of preparatory bombardment. The German soldiers went underground and waited. They emerged when the shelling stopped, because the stopping of the shelling was the signal that infantry was coming, and they moved back to their firing positions and waited a little longer. And then the British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking across no man's land, and the German machine gunners fired. 19,410 British soldiers were killed on the first day of July, 1916. Another 38,000 were wounded. Many of those wounds were catastrophic. This remains the single bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. By any measure of human cost, it was a disaster. The official report to London did not describe it as a disaster. It described the operation as having achieved certain objectives, which was technically accurate for a small number of the assault sectors where the British advance had made some progress. The overall result, the net gain measured against the net cost, was not presented in those terms. What happened after the 1st of July is less well known than the first day itself, and in some ways, it is more instructive. The campaign did not stop. It continued for 4.5 more months. The British kept attacking. The Germans kept counterattacking to recover ground they had lost. The French attacked on the southern portion of the line. The daily attrition ground on. The weather deteriorated in October and November, turning the already destroyed landscape into a deep mud that made movement nearly impossible and medical evacuation a prolonged ordeal. Men drowned in shell craters. Stretcher bearers sank to their thighs, trying to carry wounded across open ground. The campaign ended in November when the ground had frozen hard enough to prevent further operations, having advanced the British line an average of perhaps 6 miles at its deepest penetration. The casualties for the full campaign were approximately 420,000 British, 200,000 French, and 500,000 German, over 1 million men, for 6 miles. These numbers are real, they are not in dispute, they are in the official records. And the question that the romantic version of the war cannot comfortably answer is, what do you do with numbers like that? Not morally, in the sense of how you feel about them, but practically, in the sense of what the institution does with them, because the institution had to do something with them. You cannot have 420,000 casualties without processing them in some way. The bodies had to be buried where that was possible. The wounded had to be evacuated and treated. The missing had to be reported, catalogued, communicated to families. The replacement drafts had to be organized and trained and transported to fill the gaps. All of this had to be done while the campaign was still ongoing, while shells were still falling, while new operations were being planned. The answer to the question is that institutions process large numbers by converting them into procedure. Procedure is the technology of scale. When the numbers become too large for individual human response, procedure takes over. There are forms to fill out. There are categories to assign. There is a process for every situation. A man wounded slightly goes to the regimental aid post, then to the casualty clearing station, then perhaps to a base hospital, then perhaps to England. A man killed goes to a burial party when one is available, or remains where he fell until the ground changes hands or the war ends. A man missing is reported missing, and the paperwork begins. At every stage there are forms and registers and reports. The forms do not grieve. The registers do not grieve. The reports go up the chain, and the next report comes down and the procedure continues. This is not a criticism of the people who administered it. Many of them worked with genuine dedication under conditions of extreme stress. The medical officers were frequently overwhelmed beyond any reasonable capacity. The stretcher bearers worked until they collapsed. The administrative staff in the casualty clearing stations and base hospitals processed thousands of cases a week with whatever resources they had. The point is not that individuals failed. The point is that the system, as a system, had an effect on human experience that went beyond the sum of individual decisions. The system normalized what it processed. It could not have functioned otherwise. The normalization of the casualty process had specific, documented effects on the men who passed through it. Medical records from the Somme period, including records that were restricted for decades after the war, show a consistent pattern that the official narrative of the war consistently minimized. Men who survived the 1st of July and subsequent operations, and who remained in the line through the autumn of 1916, showed accelerating rates of what the medical documentation of the period called nervous collapse, shell shock, neurasthenia, war neurosis, and a variety of other terms that were used somewhat interchangeably. The terminology was inconsistent, partly because the condition itself was not well understood, and partly because there were significant institutional pressures against recognizing it as a genuine medical condition at all. The institutional pressure against recognizing psychological breakdown as a medical condition derived from a straightforward military logic. If mental collapse was a legitimate response to combat experience, then any man who could no longer function might have a legitimate claim to be removed from the line. If large numbers of men could be removed from the line on these grounds, the fighting capacity of the army would be degraded. Therefore, the official position for a significant portion of the war was that men who showed these symptoms were either physically ill with some identifiable cause, in which case they were treated medically, or they were malingering, in which case they were subject to disciplinary action. A third category, men who had genuinely lost the capacity to control their behavior due to sustained psychological trauma, was acknowledged with considerable reluctance and in limited numbers. The practical consequences of this approach were significant. Men who could not stop shaking, men who had lost the ability to speak, men who woke screaming every night and could not explain what they had seen, men who simply could not make themselves go back to the front. After a period of leave, these men were often returned to duty. The medical system had neither the capacity nor the institutional mandate to absorb them in large numbers. Those who were eventually identified as genuinely unfit for further service went through a process that was itself slow and inconsistent. Those who refused orders or who broke under fire faced courts-martial. Some of them were shot. The British Army executed 306 soldiers during the First World War for offences including desertion, cowardice, and murder. The cases were reviewed in subsequent decades, And in 2006, the British Parliament passed legislation granting posthumous pardons to all those executed for desertion and cowardice. The pardons were broadly acknowledged as recognition that many of these men had been suffering from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The pardons did not restore them to life. They did not restore them to their families, most of whom were dead by 2006. The pardons were a gesture made by institutions to their own institutional conscience, 7 or 8 decades after the fact. The fog along the Somme in the autumn of 1916 was not metaphorical. It was a physical phenomenon, a combination of the natural autumn mist of the river valley and the smoke of constant artillery fire and the steam rising from churned earth and stagnant water. It settled into the low ground every night and sometimes persisted well into the morning. It was both dangerous and useful. It provided cover for patrols moving between the lines. It also disoriented men who were already in a landscape that bore no resemblance to anything they had known before the war. The landscape of the Somme battlefield in October 1916 had been essentially destroyed. Months of intensive artillery fire had removed every recognizable feature. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to scattered rubble, so thoroughly ground that the rubble itself was no longer clearly identifiable as having been buildings. Trees were stumps or were entirely gone, leaving only a crater where the roots had been. The roads had been shelled into ruin and repaired with temporary surface material that sank into the mud. The fields had been turned into an irregular surface of overlapping shell craters, some of them 20 or 30 feet across and 10 feet deep, many of them filled with water. At night, in the fog, crossing this landscape was an exercise in dead reckoning in terrain that offered no dead reckoning points. You navigated by compass and by time and by luck. The patrol that went out that autumn night had a compass and a specific set of objectives. They were to proceed to a point approximately 150 yards into no man's land, observe the German wire line at a specified location, and return with information about whether recent shelling had created gaps in the wire that might facilitate a future raid. This was routine patrol work. It was conducted most nights by multiple patrols along the front. The patrol was of standard size for this type of mission. Somewhere between 4 and 8 men under a non-commissioned officer or a junior officer. They went out through the wire at a specified gap and proceeded on compass bearing. They did not come back. In the morning, the section leader waited for them and they did not appear. He reported it to his officer. The officer reported it up the chain. By the time the report reached battalion level, it was a brief notation in the morning summary. Patrol of 7 men, listed by name and rank, failed to return from mission conducted the previous night. Missing, presumed killed or captured. The 7 names were entered into the casualty register. Replacement drafts would cover the deficit in due course. The morning report continued with other items. What happened to them cannot now be known with certainty. The possibilities that could be documented by the records of the period include: they were killed by German fire while crossing no man's land. They were captured and taken into German captivity. They became disoriented in the fog and moved in the wrong direction, possibly into the German lines. They were killed by friendly artillery that did not know they were in the area. They fell into one of the water-filled shell craters and drowned. Some combination of these. The German records for the relevant sector on that date do not clearly record a capture of 7 British soldiers, though the German records for that period are also incomplete. No bodies were subsequently identified at the relevant location when the battlefield was cleared after the war. The battlefield was cleared after the war by large working parties that spent years moving across the former front. They recovered bodies where they could be found, which was not always possible because the shelling had buried men at considerable depth and because the mud had absorbed material that was never recovered. The Imperial War Graves Commission, established during the war and formalized after it, organized the identification and burial of recovered remains. They built cemeteries. They built walls for those whose remains could not be recovered or identified. The Thiepval Memorial on the Somme, dedicated to the missing of the Somme battles, carries the names of 72,195 men whose graves are not known. 72,000 names on a wall, each name representing a man who was never found, or was found but could not be identified, or was identified only as belonging to a unit rather than an individual. The wall is impressive. It is large. Standing in front of it produces a particular kind of silence. But it is worth spending a moment with what the wall actually represents, which is a record of the limits of recovery, a monument to the incompleteness of accounting, a stone inscription of the fact that the system could not track all of what it consumed. The wall is not a memorial to heroism, though it is often described in those terms. It is a ledger of what was lost and could not be found. The First World War consumed men in quantities that the societies which produced them had not previously had to process. The scale was genuinely new. Previous wars had produced large casualty figures, but not at this rate, not continuously, not with this degree of industrial efficiency. The Napoleonic Wars, which were the previous benchmark for European large-scale conflict, killed perhaps 3 to 4 million people over the course of roughly 20 years. The First World War killed approximately 17 million people, combatants and civilians, in 4 years. The daily rate of death was different in kind, not just in scale. The processing of death at this scale required institutional innovation. The armies of the major powers had to develop entirely new systems for managing the dead and the wounded and the missing. The British system, which is the best documented in English, began the war with casualty handling procedures designed for a professional army of a few 100,000 men, and had to rapidly scale to handle the casualties of a mass conscript army of millions. The scaling was never entirely successful. Records were lost, paperwork was not completed, identifications were incorrect. Men were buried in the wrong graves. Men were reported dead who were actually prisoners. Men were reported missing who had already been buried. The administrative machinery of death was imperfect at the scale it was asked to operate. The families at home received letters from the War Office that used a consistent and carefully controlled vocabulary. The vocabulary was not designed to deceive in a simple sense, but it was designed to manage information in a way that maintained social stability. The death of a son was communicated in language that emphasized service and sacrifice and duty. The conditions under which the death occurred were not described in detail. The specific nature of the wounds was rarely specified. The context of the death: the unit was holding a section of trench and came under sustained artillery fire for several hours, and your son was killed by a shell fragment that removed most of his skull, was not the kind of context that appeared in casualty notifications. The notification said that he had died bravely in the service of his country. This was in many cases true. It was never the whole truth. The management of information about the war extended well beyond casualty notifications. The British press operated under a censorship system administered by the War Office that controlled what could and could not be reported from the front. The censorship was not absolute, and it evolved over the course of the war, but in the critical early years it was quite effective at preventing descriptions of conditions in the trenches from reaching the general public in their full form. Journalists who were accredited to the British Expeditionary Force were required to submit their copy to military censors before transmission. Items that were considered likely to damage morale or provide useful information to the enemy were removed. The definition of both categories was broad. The visual record of the war was similarly managed. The British Army did not permit press photographers at the front during the first year of the war, and maintained strict controls on photography throughout. Official photographers were eventually credentialed, but their output was reviewed before release. Images of British dead were not published in the British press during the war. Images of German dead were sometimes published, framed as evidence of enemy losses. The asymmetry in what was shown and what was withheld was consistent and deliberate. The public was permitted to understand that the war was costly. It was not permitted to see the specific form that cost took in any detail that might make abstract numbers suddenly concrete. This information management had a specific purpose, which was the maintenance of civilian willingness to continue supporting the war. By 1916, the original volunteer army that had responded to Kitchener's recruitment campaign had been largely consumed. Conscription had been introduced in January 1916. The government needed the civilian population to continue accepting the loss of their sons and brothers and husbands and fathers in sufficient numbers to sustain the armies in the field. Public opinion, which had been enthusiastically supportive in August 1914, was more complicated by 1916. The management of information was part of the mechanism by which that opinion was kept within bounds that allowed the war to continue. The soldiers themselves operated within a similar information management framework, but in the opposite direction. They were not supposed to communicate to the home front the reality of what they were experiencing. Soldiers' letters home were subject to censorship by their officers, which meant that a private writing to his mother could not describe what he had actually seen without the letter being stopped. The censorship was inconsistently applied, and soldiers developed ways of conveying information obliquely. But the general effect was to create two parallel worlds, the world of the front and the world of the home, with a controlled and filtered communication channel between them. This separation had consequences that persisted long after the war ended. Men who returned from the front often found that they could not communicate their experience to people who had not shared it. The gap was not merely emotional, but cognitive. The reference points did not exist. The sounds of an artillery barrage at close range, the smell of a trench that had been occupied for months, the specific quality of fear produced by waiting to go over the top. These were not experiences that language developed in peacetime could adequately represent, and they were certainly not experiences that someone who had spent the war at home could readily receive. The veterans frequently stopped trying to explain. They talked about the small things, the humor, the camaraderie, the incidental details, and kept the larger structure of what they had experienced somewhere interior and inaccessible. The medical consequences of sustained exposure to the conditions of trench warfare in the Somme sector specifically were documented in ways that only became fully visible to historians much later. The physical conditions in the trenches were a constant source of illness independent of combat. The trenches were dug in ground that had variable drainage, and in the Somme sector, the chalk substrate meant that the trenches could drain reasonably in dry conditions, but became saturated immediately when it rained. Men stood in water and mud for extended periods. Trench foot, the result of prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, was epidemic. The condition began with swelling and numbness, and could progress to tissue death that required amputation. By the autumn of 1916, it had become a significant drain on effective fighting strength, and officers were required to inspect their men's feet regularly, and to ensure they changed socks when possible. Lice were universal. Every man in the trenches had lice. The lice were not merely unpleasant but medically significant because they were vectors for trench fever, a debilitating illness caused by a bacteria that produced recurring fever and severe pain. Trench fever did not kill directly, but incapacitated men for extended periods, and was a significant contributor to the overall sick rate. The cause was not clearly identified until relatively late in the war, which meant that for much of the conflict, men were treated for the symptoms without any effective means of preventing reinfection from the lice they continued to carry. Rats were common in the trenches, particularly in sectors where bodies could not be recovered and buried. The rats fed on the dead and were consequently large and numerous. Men who were exhausted would find rats investigating their rations or their personal effects. The rats were also potential vectors for disease, though this was less clearly documented than the lice problem. They were primarily a psychological factor, a constant reminder of what was being consumed in the ground around them. The diet in the trenches was monotonous and often nutritionally inadequate. The theoretical ration was reasonably calculated to maintain a man in health, but the practical delivery of rations to forward positions was frequently disrupted by shelling, mud, and the difficulty of moving supplies across destroyed ground. Men in the front line for extended periods subsisted on what could be brought forward in insulated containers that had frequently cooled significantly by the time they arrived. The biscuit ration was hard enough to chip teeth. The tinned bully beef was edible, but deeply unremarkable after the 100th consecutive consumption. Fresh vegetables appeared rarely. Fruit, almost never. The physical condition of men after extended periods in the line reflected the inadequacy of what they were eating, the cold they were enduring, and the work they were being required to do. Sleep in the trenches was fragmented and insufficient. The military system required a stand-to at dawn and dusk, the periods of maximum likelihood of attack, which meant that men were required to be at their firing positions and alert during the periods when they would most naturally have been sleeping. During the night, the sentry duty schedule ensured that most men got at most a few continuous hours of sleep, on improvised bunks or simply in corners of the trench if dugouts were not available. The constant artillery fire at unpredictable intervals disrupted sleep further. Over weeks and months of continuous frontline service, the cumulative sleep deficit became a significant factor in cognitive function. Men made decisions in states of exhaustion that would not have been made by the same men in normal conditions. The rotation system, which was designed to give infantry units periodic relief from frontline service, was under constant strain during the Somme campaign because the operational demands of the offensive required more infantry in the line than the system had been designed to accommodate. Units that should have been rotated back for rest and refitting were kept in the line beyond their scheduled rotation. Rest periods were shortened. Training time was reduced. The system of relief that was supposed to prevent the complete psychological and physical destruction of the infantry was compressed and in places suspended entirely. This is the context in which the patrol went out on that autumn night. The men who made up that patrol had been in the Somme sector for some portion of the campaign. They had endured the conditions described. They were tired, probably chronically tired, in the specific way that a man becomes tired when he has not slept properly for weeks. They were probably carrying some degree of physical illness, either documented or not, because the base rate of illness in the trenches meant that most men at any given time had something wrong with them physically. They were going out into a landscape that had been methodically destroyed by months of heavy artillery and that was now covered in fog and filled with water-filled shell craters that could swallow a man. They had done this before, or others like them had done this before and told them about it. The patrol routine was known to them. They understood the procedure. They would follow the compass bearing and move as quietly as possible and observe and return. They had done the calculation that men in combat make about risk, the calculation that is not really a calculation at all, but a kind of management of the knowledge that the risk is real and the outcome genuinely uncertain. They went out through the wire. The 7 names were entered into the regimental casualty register. The register was compiled, along with the rest of the battalion's records, into the war diary that was submitted to the relevant administrative authority, and eventually, in a reduced and reviewed form, to the public record. The war diary is in an archive. It has been read by historians and by individuals researching their family history. The 7 names appear in the relevant entry. There is nothing else. The register records their last rank and their last position and the date and the category of casualty. Missing. Missing is a category that has a particular quality in the context of the First World War. It is a category that acknowledges that the accounting system has reached its limit. The system knows the men existed. The system knows they went into an area from which they did not return. The system does not know what happened to them. The category of missing is the system's notation of its own incompleteness, a bureaucratic acknowledgement of the limits of industrial-scale record-keeping applied to industrial-scale killing. The limits of record-keeping at this scale were not accidental. They reflected the speed and scale of the operations. In the Somme campaign, units were engaged in operations that moved quickly enough in some sectors that the administrative processes simply could not keep up. Men were killed and buried in the moment without complete identification procedures being followed. Men were killed and not buried at all, their remains eventually incorporated into the landscape through the action of subsequent shelling. Men were killed, and their identification tags were taken by those who found them, but the tags never reached the relevant administrative office because the person carrying them was subsequently killed. The chain of documentation that was supposed to move from death to registration to notification was broken at multiple points, routinely, as a function of the pace and scale of the operations. The Imperial War Graves Commission's work after the war was partly an attempt to reconstruct the documentation that had been broken during it. They interviewed survivors. They examined the German records that had been captured or transferred under the terms of the armistice. They conducted systematic surveys of the battlefield areas. They recovered remains from positions that had been inaccessible during the fighting. They identified what they could and recorded what they could not identify. The Thiepval Memorial, with its 72,000 names, represents the residue of this process, the portion that could not be resolved. The cemetery work on the Somme continued into the 1920s and in a reduced form into the 1930s. Ground was still yielding remains 2 decades after the fighting ended. Farmers plowing fields in what had been the battle zone were regularly turning up bones and equipment and unexploded ordnance. The ordnance was particularly persistent. The iron harvest, as it came to be called, the annual crop of unexploded shells brought up by agricultural activity, continued throughout the 20th century and continues in the 21st. Approximately 12% of shells fired during the First World War failed to detonate immediately, and the soil around the former Somme battlefield still contains a significant quantity of them. People have been killed by First World War ordnance on the Somme within living memory. The persistence of the ordnance is not merely a hazard statistic, it is a physical demonstration of the scale of what was deposited in that ground. 1.5 million shells fired in 7 days of preliminary bombardment before the campaign even began in earnest. Then 4.5 months of continued fire on both sides. The density of metal in that ground is a record of an industrial process that was applied to a specific patch of French countryside and that continues to affect it more than a century later. The scale of the munitions production that fed this process is itself a kind of historical fact that resists easy comprehension. The British shell production crisis of 1915, which was the result of the Army's initial failure to anticipate the rate at which artillery would consume ammunition in trench warfare, precipitated a political crisis serious enough to bring down the government and lead to the creation of the Ministry of Munitions under Lloyd George. The Ministry of Munitions reorganized British industrial production on a war footing that involved the conversion of factories, the training of hundreds of thousands of workers, the employment of women in industrial roles at scale for the first time, and the systematic direction of a significant portion of the British economy toward the production of shells and the components that shells required. By 1916, British shell production had reached levels that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. The shells were produced in factories where workers, a large proportion of them women, worked long shifts with toxic materials in conditions that produced occupational illness and injury. TNT exposure caused a yellowing of the skin that gave the nickname "Canary Girls" to the women who worked with it, but also caused more serious systemic effects. Cordite handling produced headaches and other symptoms. Explosive accidents killed workers at intervals throughout the war. The health of the factory workers who produced the ordnance that the soldiers fired was itself a casualty of the industrial war, though one that received considerably less documentation and no monuments. The transformation of civilian society that the First World War required was unprecedented and, in the initial years, inadequately anticipated. The armies consumed men faster than the societies that produced them had been organized to supply. Voluntary enlistment, which in Britain produced several million men in the first year of the war, was not sufficient to maintain the army at the required strength as the casualty rate accumulated. Conscription was the institutional response. The Military Service Act of January 1916 introduced compulsory military service for single men between 18 and 41, subsequently extended to married men. The introduction of conscription was a significant social rupture in a society that had not previously had a tradition of universal military service, and it generated both administrative machinery and political opposition that persisted through the rest of the war. The conscription machinery had to identify, classify, and process millions of men. It had to assess their fitness for military service in various categories. It had to deal with claims for exemption on grounds of essential civilian occupation, family circumstances, and conscientious objection. The conscientious objectors represented a small but significant challenge to the system. Approximately 16,000 men in Britain claimed conscientious objection to military service during the First World War. They were processed through tribunals of varying consistency and quality. Those whose objections were accepted were assigned to non-combatant service. Those whose objections were not accepted faced imprisonment for refusing orders. Some of them were sent to France and threatened with execution. This was ultimately not carried out, but the threat was made and the men were held for extended periods in extremely difficult conditions. The social pressure on men of military age who were not in uniform was substantial and deliberately cultivated. The practice of presenting white feathers to men in civilian clothes as a symbol of cowardice was organized and encouraged in certain contexts. The emotional and social costs of refusing military service for any reason were considerable. Men who had legitimate medical exemptions sometimes found their exemptions challenged by neighbors or community opinion. The social machinery of military pressure operated alongside the legal machinery of conscription. This social pressure was part of a broader system of consent management. The government, the press, and various civilian organizations cooperated with varying degrees of formal coordination in maintaining public support for the war. The language of duty, sacrifice, and necessity was applied consistently. The specific costs of the war, the physical and psychological damage to the men who fought it, were managed through the information control systems already described. The result was a society that continued to send its men into a war whose actual conditions it did not fully understand, because the information that would have altered that calculus was controlled at the source. The realities that were being managed included not only the combat conditions and casualty rates, but also the medical aftermath. The hospitals in England, by 1916, were full of men whose injuries did not fit the narrative of noble sacrifice. Men with faces destroyed by shrapnel. Men with limbs amputated at multiple joints. Men with gas damage to their lungs that would give them a slow death over years. Men with neurological damage of various kinds. Men with psychiatric conditions that had no standard treatment and no clear prognosis. The care of these men required the conversion of large buildings, including schools and country houses and public institutions, into hospital facilities. The communities around these facilities encountered the physical results of industrial warfare in a more immediate way than most, and accounts from the period describe the social management of these encounters. The pension system for disabled veterans, which had to be developed essentially from scratch during the war to handle numbers that the existing system had not been designed for, was a source of significant administrative controversy. The assessment of disability was contested. The level of pension provided was a subject of political dispute. Men who had lost limbs or vision in service of the state found themselves navigating a bureaucratic system that was fundamentally not designed to handle their cases in the numbers they existed. The letters and appeals from veterans and their families to the various relevant offices form a significant portion of the primary source record of the war's aftermath, a record of individuals attempting to communicate with an institution that had processed their cases and moved on. The institution had moved on because there was always something else to move on to. The war did not pause to accommodate the administrative consequences of the previous week's operations. The battle generated its casualties and its missing and its administrative requirements, and the system attempted to process them, and where it could not, it noted the gap and continued. The 7 names in the regimental diary were a gap that the system noted and continued past. The Thiepval Memorial is a wall of 72,000 gaps. The fog along the Somme is real in the meteorological records of October 1916. The meteorological records were kept because weather affected artillery observation and therefore was militarily relevant information. The fogs are documented as occurring on multiple consecutive nights in the relevant period. dense enough to reduce visibility to a few yards, settling into the river valley and spreading across the flat agricultural land to the north. The records note the fog the same way they note everything else, as data, as condition, as factor. The 7 men moved into that condition. They became, within the terms of the accounting system, part of the factor. They were not the only patrol lost in those weeks. The nightly patrol operations across the Somme front were producing a steady rate of casualties and missing that was processed through the same system. The system did not distinguish between individual disappearances except for the purpose of individual administrative notification. 7 names, 7 next of kin, 7 letters. 7 gaps in the regiment that were filled with replacements who had come from somewhere else in England, from some village or town or city, from families who would in due course receive their own letters. The replacement system during the Somme campaign was under significant strain. The training period for new soldiers had been progressively shortened as the demand for infantry outpaced the supply. Men who entered training with no prior military experience were moving through the system in fewer months than had originally been considered necessary to produce a competent soldier. The result was that the men arriving at the front as replacements were, on average, less experienced and less prepared than those they were replacing. This had operational consequences that compounded over time. Experienced infantry could perform tasks that inexperienced infantry could not, and the experience level of the British infantry force declined as the campaign continued, and the experienced men were killed or wounded and replaced with less experienced men. The commanders were aware of this dynamic. It appears in the intelligence assessments and the operational planning documents. It was one of the factors that informed decisions about the pace and scale of operations, though it was rarely the decisive factor. The offensive logic of the campaign, the need to maintain pressure on the German line, to justify the previous casualties by continuing to press for the gains those casualties were supposed to purchase, was consistently given priority over the qualitative degradation of the force. The justification of previous casualties by continued operation is a specific form of institutional logic that appears consistently in the documentation of the Somme campaign. The argument made explicitly in some documents and implicitly in the general framework of operational decision-making was that to stop the offensive would be to render the previous casualties meaningless. This argument has a certain internal coherence, and it is recognizable from other contexts of institutional decision-making where the sunk cost of previous investment is used to justify continued investment. What is notable in the Somme context is the scale of the sunk cost being used to justify further expenditure. The 19,000 dead of the 1st of July became an argument for continuing operations that produced further hundreds of thousands of casualties, on the logic that to stop would be to admit that the original cost had been borne for nothing. This logic was not unique to the British command. The French at Verdun, which was the other dominant operation of 1916, operated under a similar framework. The German command, which initiated the Verdun offensive in February with an explicit strategic intention of bleeding the French army to the point of collapse, found itself trapped by the same logic when the French proved unexpectedly resilient, and the German casualties at Verdun began to approach French casualties. The offensive at Verdun continued long after the original strategic logic had been invalidated by the actual results on the ground, because the institutional and political costs of stopping had become comparable to the military costs of continuing. The 2 great battles of 1916, Verdun and the Somme, consumed approximately 2.5 million casualties between them across all the armies involved over the course of the year. They produced no decisive strategic result. The front line at the end of 1916 was not dramatically different from the front line at the beginning of 1916. The German army was under strain but had not collapsed. The French army was under strain but had not collapsed. The British army had expanded and demonstrated its capacity for large-scale offensive operations, but had not achieved a breakthrough. Both sides had demonstrated that the other could be made to suffer at scale. Neither had demonstrated that the other could be defeated. This is the military reality of 1916, and it was understood at the time, at least by those whose job it was to assess it. The intelligence estimates, the operational reports, the communications between the army commanders and the political leadership, these documents show a persistent awareness that the war was not progressing toward a clear conclusion. The public language of war, aims and victory, and the breaking of German power continued. The internal language of operational assessment was more measured and more uncertain. The medical language of the same period is the most honest of all, partly because the medical officers had no particular institutional interest in representing the situation in terms more favorable than the evidence supported. The casualty clearing station reports, the field hospital records, the reports from the neurological hospitals that were established to handle the growing number of psychiatric casualties. These documents describe what the war was doing to the men who fought it with a directness that the operational reports rarely matched. They describe wounds in clinical detail. They describe psychological conditions in the available vocabulary. They describe the rates of return to duty and the rates of permanent incapacity and the rates of death from wounds. They do not describe courage or sacrifice or duty. They describe injuries. A shell wound, in the clinical language of the period, is described by location, depth, and extent of tissue damage. A shell fragment entering the abdomen at a specified point and traversing a specified distance is a set of anatomical coordinates. The prognosis for abdominal wounds in the field conditions of 1916 was poor. Surgical intervention was possible at the casualty clearing stations, but required speed and conditions that were not always available. The infection rate in wounds treated under field conditions was high, because the soil of the Somme was heavily contaminated with the anaerobic bacteria that cause gas gangrene and tetanus, and because the explosive trauma of shell wounds drove fragments of clothing and dirt deep into tissue that was then difficult to clean adequately. Men who reached surgical care quickly and received appropriate treatment had significantly better outcomes than men who did not. Many men did not. The anaerobic bacteria in the Somme soil were partly a product of the agricultural history of the region. The fields had been intensively cultivated for centuries, and the soil contained the organic matter that supports high bacterial populations. The introduction of large quantities of decaying organic material, in the form of the dead, and the horses and the food waste, added to the bacterial load. The specific conditions of the trenches, which were confined, wet, and filled with waste material that could not be adequately removed, created an environment that was essentially ideal for the propagation of infectious organisms. The disease rates in the trenches were a function of this environment as much as they were a function of enemy action. The horses are a dimension of the First World War that is rarely given adequate attention. The armies on the Western Front still relied heavily on horse transport for the movement of supplies, artillery, and equipment. The British Expeditionary Force maintained several 100,000 horses on the Western Front throughout the war. These horses suffered casualties at rates comparable to the human soldiers. They were killed by artillery fire, they died from disease, they were worked to exhaustion and collapsed. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals maintained a veterinary corps that treated hundreds of thousands of animal casualties. The suffering of horses was documented in some cases with more immediate emotional response from observers than the suffering of men, perhaps because the horses had not chosen to be there, and perhaps because the cultural attachment to horses in early 20th century Britain was more explicit than the attachment to the men of the lower classes who made up the bulk of the infantry. The social composition of the infantry force is a dimension of the war's history that the romantic narrative tends to universalize into a collective experience of national sacrifice. The actual composition was heavily weighted toward the working class and the lower middle class. The officer class was drawn from a different social stratum and had a different relationship to the war, both in terms of how it was experienced and how it was subsequently represented. The war literature that shaped public understanding of the conflict in the decades after it ended was predominantly produced by men of the officer class who had the education and the cultural resources to write and publish. Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Robert Graves, Edmund Blunden. These men represent one experience of the war. The experience of the private soldiers who made up the vast majority of the army was documented in letters and diaries, and in the oral history projects that were conducted decades later, but it entered the broader culture less completely. The private soldiers' experience of the war was more directly material than the officers', more immediately concerned with the physical facts of cold and wet, and hunger and exhaustion, and the proximity of death, and less mediated by the literary and intellectual frameworks that the officer class had available to process experience. This is not a judgment about the depth or authenticity of the experience, which is not accessible from the outside. It is an observation about the available record. The regimental diary entry that records 7 names as missing is a fragment of the private soldier's record. It is complete in itself as a bureaucratic document. It is not complete as a record of those 7 lives or of what happened to them. The 7 men of the patrol came from somewhere. They had homes and families and histories that predated the war. They had enlisted or been conscripted into service, gone through whatever training was available to them, been assigned to a unit and transported to France, moved through the replacement system to the relevant sector of the front, and arrived at the point of going out through the wire on that foggy autumn night. Each of them was a person whose existence had been, before the war, largely unconnected to the industrialized killing process that was now their immediate environment. The war had absorbed them. It had assigned them a rank and a unit and a role. It had equipped them with a rifle and a uniform, and a steel helmet and a gas mask, and the other equipment that a soldier in 1916 carried. It had trained them, to the extent that training was available, in the specific techniques of trench warfare. They knew things that no one before 1914 had needed to know. They knew how to read a barbed wire obstacle in darkness and find the gaps or make them. They knew how to move quietly across broken ground. They knew how to use a compass at night. They knew what a German flare looked like when it went up and what you did when it went up, which was to freeze and remain motionless until it burned out. They knew what a machine gun's range was and at what angles it was most dangerous. They knew how to find cover in ground that had no natural cover. They knew things that were specifically and exclusively useful for industrial trench warfare. Things that had not existed as a body of knowledge before the war created the conditions that required them. They went into the fog with this knowledge, and they did not come back. The system recorded their departure and the absence of their return, and moved on to the next item. The war continued for 2 more years after the Somme campaign ended. It accumulated further casualties at rates somewhat below the maximum intensity of 1916, but consistent and continuous. By November 1918, when the armistice was signed, the total dead from all causes and all parties to the conflict were in the range of 17 million. The wounded were more numerous still, perhaps 20 million, a significant portion of them permanently disabled. The number of surviving combatants who carried psychiatric damage that was never formally diagnosed or treated was never accurately counted because the diagnostic and recording systems of the period were not adequate to the task. The armistice of November 11, 1918 was not a peace treaty. It was a ceasefire. The gun stopped at 11 in the morning on the 11th day of the 11th month. A coincidence of numbers that was apparently deliberate but has never been conclusively explained in terms of why that specific time and date. In the hours before the armistice came into effect, there was continued fighting along the front. Artillery fired. Men were killed. On the last day of the war, casualties were running at a rate comparable to the operational norm for a day of moderate activity. The men who were killed in the hours before 11 on the 11th of November were killed for no operational reason. There was no territory being gained or defended. The armistice had already been signed at 5 in the morning. The fighting continued until 11 because the orders said it would continue until 11. The last British soldier to be killed in the First World War, according to the available records, was Private George Ellison, who died at approximately 9:55 in the morning of November 11, 1918. He had survived the entire war up to that point, including the Somme. He was killed by a sniper in a village near Mons, Belgium, approximately 65 minutes before the armistice came into effect. He was 36 years old. He was from Leeds. His name is on the register. The war ended and the register closed, and the total was added up, and the system moved on to the next administrative requirement, which was the demobilization of several million men and the reconstruction of the societies that had spent 4 years consuming themselves. The reconstruction did not restore what had been consumed. The men who came back were not the men who had left. The societies they returned to were different from the societies they had departed. The economies had been transformed, in some ways permanently, by the demands of the war. The social arrangements that had existed before 1914 had been altered by conscription, by the employment of women in new roles, by the disruption of communities, by the death of the men who would have otherwise been the next generation of social and economic leaders. The demographic gap produced by the deaths of military-age men in the most productive years of their lives had consequences that extended through subsequent decades. The peace settlement, which was negotiated at Paris in 1919 and embodied primarily in the Treaty of Versailles, imposed conditions on Germany that were partly designed as punishment and partly as security measures and partly as satisfaction of the various national claims of the Allied powers. The conditions were contested from the beginning, by German opinion and by a significant portion of international informed opinion, as excessively punitive and economically irrational. The reparations demanded were substantially beyond Germany's capacity to pay in the short term. The territorial arrangements created new national minorities and new grievances. The political and economic instability that followed the settlement contributed to the conditions that produced, 20 years later, the second version of the European Industrial War. The First World War did not end in any meaningful sense in November 1918. It suspended. It left unresolved the fundamental questions of European political order that had contributed to its beginning. It left millions of men with physical and psychological damage that would affect their lives and the lives of their families for decades. It left the ground of the former Western Front contaminated with ordnance that still kills people. It left 72,000 names on a wall at Thiepval, and similar walls and registers and incomplete records at equivalent sites across France and Belgium and the other theaters of the conflict. It established, as a normal feature of modern warfare, the expectation of industrial-scale casualties, the administrative processing of mass death, and the institutional management of public response to that processing. These were not temporary conditions. They were the inheritance. The 7 names in the regimental diary remained 7 names. The patrol crossed the wire and entered the fog and did not return, and the regimental diary noted it and continued. And the war continued. And the system that the war had built to process its own outputs continued, and the November armistice came, and the guns stopped, and the system began the process of dismantling and demobilizing and accounting for what remained accountable, and the 7 names remained in the category of missing. They were not found. They were not identified. They did not receive a grave. They received eventually the status of the missing of the Somme, which is a status that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains to this day, which means that their names are on the register, that their sacrifice is acknowledged, and that the specific circumstances of their deaths remain unknown. The system continued until the war ended, and then it produced the records it had generated, and those records were archived, and the 7 names are in the archive, and there is nothing else.